good afternoon, good evening, wherever this might find you. Welcome into the rotation. I am your co-host, Patrick Ryder, and I'm in Denver, Colorado today and today only. In the bottom corner of my screen is my illustrious co-host, Brian Jones. Brian, are you in North Carolina today?
Yes, sir. Back home.
Back home. No more travel, no more fast food. Back to the land where you need to come see me to get what you need to get. Today, we are very excited to have Peter Sue join us as we're kind of back in the rotation with a couple guests. And Peter's joining us in New York.
Yeah, New York. I'm on Long Island.
I got to be honest with you, tracking Peter down is tough. He was in LA. He's all over the place, working with Green Check on the banking side of things. And today he's on Long Island, so probably not too far from our third member of our team, George, who couldn't be with us. I think he's actually in Manhattan today. But with that being said, today we're going to talk a little bit and peel the onion back on safe banking and what the actual impacts are, not only from a cost load standpoint to cannabis companies and banks, but what it actually means outside of just deposits. So as we do with everyone, we're going to start off and understand a little bit more about how Peter got involved in the cannabis industry and what drew him here and what he's doing now. Peter.
Thank you. That was a kind of a cold open, but I'm okay with that. I got to say, I've done a lot of podcasts. I've never had multiple hosts, so this is a new experience for me.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we sit on, Brian and I sit on opposite sides of the fence in our industries, our professional industries. And so we think that, I look at it one way, he looks at it very, very differently. And it leads to some good conversations.
So as I mentioned to you, honestly, I wish I had a cool, personalized story, but I don't. I was working at a bank. The bank was starting a cannabis banking division, and I said, "That sounds awesome. I can do it." I pitched my way into the role, and it's been a great ride. But unfortunately, like I said, I literally just raised my hand and said, "I'd love to do that."
And when we talked about it, there was a little bit about specialization, right? You were in a scenario where some guys walked in and just called themselves specialists, and that added 10% to their hourly rate or something like that. Share with us a little bit about that.
It's a funny story, and first time on the air that I'm talking about this. So I was working at a bank, doing well, but what I saw was the people that I knew that tended to do, really well. They tended to have a specialization of some sort. They were really known somewhere, and what kind of pushed me over the edge was, at the time, the bank that I worked at, they brought in a crypto banking team. Now, mind you, this is 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. And these guys were crypto banking experts. And I remember thinking to myself, bullshit, right?
Yeah, no doubt. That's a bunch of bullshit back then.
I was like, wait a minute. Who the heck was forget about banking, who was experts at crypto back then, right? And these guys were crypto banking experts. And so that was the moment that I really thought to myself, okay, I can do that too. And so, like I said, I was looking around. I knew that this bank at the time was looking to kick off a cannabis banking program. And I went in there and, said, I'm your guy.
Peter, what year was that?
Let me see. This is a good, 2000. I'm going to say 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago.
All right.
Okay, so 16, 17, somewhere around there?
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating, right? People have been kicking around being a cannabis bank for 6-7 years, and we still don't have banking reform. That's good work by us.
So I spoke it into existence. I'm a cannabis banking expert.
A whisperer. Yeah, I like it. Cannabis banking expert. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, people probably call us, God, I hate to even say it because it sounds so terrible, insurance experts. But frankly, it changes so much on a daily basis that to be an expert in this space is to be a liar. It's just not possible. So. Sorry, I'll jump back out.
Yeah, you know what? We get corrected all the time, right? On the brokerage side, he's an expert. No, I'm an advocate. There's a big difference between the two things. I believe in the industry. I believe what's going on. So I think that I advocate for better insurance products rather than consider myself an expert at the products that are out there. And I'm sure the same thing applies in your world, right? You guys, one of the things about your background, actually, and we'll go and get into the expert thing, you come from a military background. So you were working on helicopters in Germany as part of your career, right? So walk us a little bit through the evolution of your professional career, because it didn't start off right. Harvard into Goldman, it was a little bit different track.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I was in the army. When I tell people this, I think they're like, "Really?" Because I was fixing turbine engines. They call it aircraft power plant repair. So in the army, that just means turbine engines on a helicopter. And so very much a rear echelon. I mean, I used to joke that if the war ever got to me, it's over. And and that's no joke. If the war got to me, it's over.
Yeah. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Taiwan originally, but I grew up here. Grew up in New York.
Okay.
Aside from my stint in the army, I've always been in New York.
All right, very good.
So we got another SUNY guy on the line, right? We always like to have the SUNY guys come on because we're better than most other state schools, including those in the greater Midwest. But while we're not going to argue about colleges or lack of football programs, talking about the cannabis banking. So we had an episode a couple clicks back with Ian Stewart for Wilson Elser. And we talked about what safe banking is and what safe banking can do. And really, we wanted to talk to you about what banking actually means for the cannabis industry. And starting off talking about the suite of services that is and is not available on the commercial side from a banking standpoint. So, Peter, you're the expert. Right, you're the cannabis banking expert. So, if you could just kind of walk us through the life of a banker in the cannabis industry and what services you're bringing to market, what services still need to be brought to market to catch up with traditional commercial banking, and then let's talk a little bit about why they're not there and how expensive it actually is.
Sure, a great question. And actually, if I could take a small step back just to establish some street cred here.
I like it.
So as much as you're joking about being an expert, I like to think I have put in a lot of time, paid my dues. I personally ran a cannabis banking program, started from the ground up, de novo program for what was then BNB. I then joined a probably the largest program in the country with East West Bank, and that's a big program. So I do bring many years of banking experience, many years of cannabis banking specifically. I'm on the NCAA banking committee. I chair the New York City Cannabis Industry Association banking committee. I'm on the Rolling Stones Cannabis Culture Council, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, all of that is to say that I think the cannabis banking has evolved a lot and very quickly over a short period of time. It wasn't that long ago. You guys can all imagine and remember when no banks wanted to do it. And a lot of that actually has to do with there is a real sort of practical reason why, aside from the risk factor, because there is a perceived risk of saying, well, we're going to bank cannabis now. What does that mean? What does that mean for our shareholders? What does that mean for our members, et cetera? The thing is, it's a lot of work. And in doing a lot of work, there's risk that something goes wrong, obviously. So, the simple answer, of course, is that, look, it is federally illegal. So by definition, every dollar is technically money laundering. So the burden of proof for the bank is that it has to fairly literally prove that every dollar of deposit in the bank can be traced to a dollar worth of legal goods. So in other words, it's not enough to just say, yeah, this is a legal, licensed business. It's a continual process because unfortunately, inversion and diversion risk, meaning buying stuff through the back door, selling stuff to the back door. Unfortunately, that's a real risk, and let's face it, there's some incentive to do so. So forget about the fact that it's a possibility. There's a pretty strong likelihood that one of your licensees might do it. That said, in the early days, it was done manually, and that was the reason that a lot of banks used to jump in and kind of jump back out. And frankly, it was also why it used to be like $10,000 a month just to have a checking account. Prior to softwares like us showing up, like Green Check Verify showing up, every program was manual. And so what that meant was, so the industry average is 5 to 8. So for every 5 to 8 cannabis businesses you bank, you would have to add another body. That's how much work is involved. So we're talking about monitoring the transactions, filing SARs, filing CTRs, continue auditing, et cetera, et cetera. Now with software, we have clients that are managing 50, 60, 80 accounts per FTE, per full-time employee. So huge difference. We're talking 10x. And so that, of course, has been, and I don't want to say that is the reason, but if you see the advent of software in the cannabis banking space, that's when you kind of see the explosion of suddenly more FIs jumping in, more financial institutions jumping in.
You know, you said something interesting about money in the door and out the back door, and there's motivation to do that. You know, that's got to be a big driver for wanting to get more ability for standard banking practices to come into this industry and legitimatize it.
Yeah.
What's the holdup? Why wouldn't that just be an immediate, sales to a congressman or a senator? You know, if we don't do this, we're just allowing, bad actors to come in here, which is exactly what we don't want. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Honestly, who knows why, right? Like it seems to make every possible good reason, right? You've got, endless stories coming from Washington State, California, Oregon, of just dispensaries being held up because there's cash there. Well, and there's inventory obviously there as well, but the presumption that there's a large amount of cash at these stores is a primary reason that they're being robbed, So why wouldn't safe banking pass? Who knows? I mean, I guess that's just how the sausage is made. I would say this, and I know we started the call this way, which is, will safe banking necessarily be a sea change? And I'm not so sure. And maybe that's a contrarian view. I think it's a great incremental step, and it really should happen, right? But if you think about it, what every bank, every financial institution that's in the space now, they follow FinCEN 2014 guidelines. So it's a combination of the Cole Memo 2014 guidelines, which is actually derived from the Cole Memo. All that safe banking really does is codify that, right? Now, it presumably will prompt more FIs into this space, meaning more banks, more credit unions will be okay with it, with cannabis banking. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing because it'll create competition, create pricing pressure, and really, to your point, maybe standardize certain things, right? Allow examiners to actually opine on the subject, allow good practices to come out, allow bad practices to go out. But at the end of the day, it's really not going to change how cannabis banking exists today. So what does it really do? Now, when we were on the phone, I know we were talking about this. I think most people think about, and of course it's in the name, right? Cannabis, safe banking. So you think it's about commercial retail banking, but maybe it isn't, because I don't think that it does much for a checking account. But if it does something for the capital markets, for example, well, that would be a big difference. If you were able to list in America on the US market versus the Canadian market, well, that could be a big difference. It certainly opens up institutional money that may not otherwise invest in cannabis companies, for example. If it opens up credit cards, that would be a sea change, right? But again, as currently written, I'm not so sure that it does either of those things.
No, and certainly I think at the back end of that, safe banking does something that we don't necessarily love, right? It's going to create long-term more regulations until there's a descheduling, until there's, an end to prohibition. All of these things are just patchwork, and we call it a death by 1,000 cuts. It's certainly something that is needed, and having access to the capital markets is an important step. But the amount of regulation that is bound to come with the passage of safe banking will be tremendous and to a degree stifling. We worked with a certain group that was looking at either going through a de-SPAC or an IPO process. And to get up to speed with the regulatory environment that exists today, and this is pre-safe banking, and this is in Canada, not in the United States, they were going to have to spend somewhere in between $750 and $1.5 million just to get their accounting department up to snuff where it needed to be a publicly traded company, which is a huge expense, but that's the burden of the regulatory environment, which will eventually lead to access to more capital. Brian, I cut you off.
No, you brought up an interesting thing about credit cards, because I do think everybody wants credit cards in these dispensaries, because it's just, it's just easy. The amount that people will spend, they think 10 to 15% more if they can use a card. What's your take on Visa's announcement with the cashless ATMs. Can you speak to any of that, or is this something you don't really touch, with what you do?
Right, we don't necessarily touch it. No.
Okay.
That said, well, the interesting thing is in that particular press release, they didn't actually say anything about the cannabis industry at all. We all presume that that's what they're referring to, but
Yep.
it doesn't specify that. That said, I think if you look at that press release, it's pretty straightforward. They're just saying you can't miscode things, right? Which, let's be honest, has always been true.
Yeah.
There's
100%.
no that the fact that you even need to say that is kind of silly. Like, of course you can't miscode it. You're obfuscating a transaction code. Are they talking about cannabis? Yeah, it seems like it, but I guess the bigger question might be, would any of these things, would this conversation even happen outside of cannabis, right? No.
No.
So in a way, it's one of those problems where it's just going to go away, kind of.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that you say that, because if it didn't have THC or cannabis on it, it's truly just selling widgets. That's all. That's all that's going on, right? The
Right.
old business school model of widgets, which is why these cryptocurrency experts, it blows my mind, because they're selling. I don't even know.
Not
So
widgets.
don't get me started on that one there. Yeah. Well, the other thing I wanted to ask about safe banking is the bill in and of itself doesn't, like you said, it's just kind of an incremental step. I think Patrick and I have talked offline. We don't think it's going to pass. We think it's going to be some bigger, comprehensive regulatory behemoth that's going to be dropped on the cannabis industry, and it's going to take it's going to be like the Sarbanes-Oxley sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
If you can look in your crystal ball, how would you like to see it formed and passed? If you could look at that, I mean, we have Safe Harbor coming up, going public. You have another company with a DEA permit that grows in New Mexico that's going to go public on the NASDAQ. I think we're assuming that NASDAQ and NYSE listings are going to happen somewhat soon. I was at Benzinga last week and heard some rumors about a few maybe seat changes. So who knows what's going to happen there? Give us your crystal ball.
I'm sorry, I don't have one. Every time I've prognosticated on these political happenings, and I'm always wrong. I'm always wrong. But again, I look at it pragmatically, right? Like, what are the effects that it will have if it passes? And so as I look at the current proposed legislation, and I think at last count there's like 6, right? Between safe banking and the State Act and et cetera, et cetera. From my perspective, I don't know that any of them truly will improve the situation. And maybe that's the question you're asking, right? Like, what effect will it have, and will it improve the situation? Because fundamentally, I would think anyone in the industry is thinking, well, why can't it just be treated like any other industry? If I were a bank looking to open an account for a liquor store, I just ask for a copy of the license and move on, right? When can we get to that? And I think it's not a question of legislation. It's going to take a whole generation of just changing people's minds about, like, it's not that big of a deal, kind of.
I still think right. I mean, liquor, you're entering in and your license and all that stuff, it's federally legal. So you're still in the process. And what I think safe banking does, and some of these bills do, is it avoids that conversation, right? Okay, now we have access, and we no longer have to have the conversation around federal legalization and what we're going to do, and people can't use that as a crux to say no. And I think that's the bigger deal around those types of bills. And to your point, there's 6 out there. I think Schumer just said that he was going to punt his bill a little while because he's not ready, and he doesn't have the right. Yeah, and he doesn't have the support. So everybody's doing something different, and we've pounded on Washington a lot. But I think, you mentioned something at the outset, kind of where your career was. And you mentioned you were with a large, East West big bank, and they're participating. So was there anything that they weren't doing from a commercial banking standpoint outside of obviously public securities, but were there any services that were still being restricted at a bank of that size? Because they can do anything for anybody for the most part. Was the cannabis division operating with one arm tied behind their back? Was there financial constraints? Can you talk a little bit about, what it was like being a banker for cannabis versus being a banker for technology at a large institution like that.
Well, out of respect for former employers, I'm not authorized to sort of speak on their behalf. But that said, I would say that no. I mean, one of the issues in the industry is not so much what a company is or is not willing to do, but as you can see, a lot of the banks in the space are relatively small. So sometimes it's just a question of capability and capacity, right? I think at some of the larger institutions that are out there now, like a Valley Bank, an East West Bank. I mean, what you're seeing is that the size of the bank is starting to get bigger, and thus, capacity, capability. These things are creeping up, and that's a good thing for the industry overall. I'm not aware that there's any limitations at all, aside from maybe like wiring money overseas, right? That's still a major gap.
Okay, and when you say overseas, are you just saying cross border? Like, is this still difficult to move money from even from the United States into Canada if you're a plant touching entity?
Yeah, sorry. Banking wise, they would consider that overseas, but yeah, it is like if you're a plant touching business, right, and you want to wire money to Canada, and that's coming directly from your plant touching entity. Generally speaking, that would be a problem.
Interesting.
What sort of problem? Just is it considered wire fraud?
No. Correspondent banks won't do it. The larger banks are your correspondents, and they won't do it. They don't want to. They won't be involved in the trade at all.
But banks that are doing it, are they skirting the rules, or just saying we're going to do it and see what happens? How would you identify them? I guess
it's usually facilitated through various means of like sending it to a trust, sending it through an attorney or something like that. It's generally like it just wouldn't be direct.
Yeah, I guess I asked that because a lot of these companies have to list in Canada, public exchanges, and have, technically legal operations there, even though they don't have to fund it with large amounts. But they do have to send money across the border to pay for certain services. So I found that interesting.
File taxes and do those types of things.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, in that scenario, it wouldn't be the direct plant touching entity. So if you've got a public, if you've got a pubco that's listed, that would be probably like a parent level holding company.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So they're just sending money to their parent. That's all they're doing. So it's not really considered cross, overseas.
Yeah. Versus like the operating level, licensees directly sending money like that. That would be that's generally not allowed.
All right. That's very good.
Cool. I mean, so there's just a lot, right? I mean, there's still more steps to take. And I think that, obviously companies like Green Check Verified are going to be in the process trying to make these steps happen a little bit quicker, because as we create profitability for banks, you said 5 to 8, and you're creating kind of 10x multiple on efficiencies. Can you talk a little bit about Green Check and where those efficiencies are coming into play, not just at the side of, hey, we create 10x efficiencies for you to take on more clients, but what services you're actually providing? Because, Bank of the Valley of the Sun of the Desert in Southwest Dakota State doesn't have the wherewithal, but might have 6 dispensaries, surrounding an oil field. I mean, you get it. So where are you guys coming into play to create efficiencies for some of the smaller institutions that can't necessarily scale like that?
Oh, I think it's the same efficiency. It really comes down to how much resource does it take for you to run your program? And more importantly, is it more accurate? Because even if you're willing to hire those bodies, you're still talking about somebody with an Excel spreadsheet and like pivot tables, right? And so regardless of whether you look at it as a scalability, thus profitability kind of question, or again, let's be honest, the examiners come in and you show them, well, this is how we do it. Peter Sue looks at these Excel spreadsheets and I've got pivot tables versus, hey, I've got this software that has gone through more bank exams than anyone in this country, which do you think looks better, right? So so while I understand the question, it's not really just purely a question of do you want to scale? It is a question of do you want to build your program correctly, more accurately? Some of it is optics too. Again, when the examiners come in, if you've got a new program and the question is, what makes you comfortable doing this? Demonstrate to me that you put in the work to make this program work. What is a better answer? I've got these Excel spreadsheets, or I bought the best software on the market.
And are you, so the guys, obviously it's a software and there's developers and there's engineers, but on the business development side, there's guys like yourself who come from a banking background that understand that, your customer requirements at Al, and you're partnering with some very large law firms. In your estimation, is there any bank that's too big for you guys to work with to open up comfort levels into the cannabis industry?
No, not at all. If they are willing, and Valley Bank, for example, and this is pretty public. They've been out in public about working with us. That's a large bank with a big program, national program. So no, if the largest banks, Citi, Chase, if suddenly they were willing, that would be great. We would be the perfect partner for them.
That's
all
great.
Right. City, Chase, Jamie Dimon. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Oh, Peter.
Yeah.
Call me Jamie.
I live in Charlotte, man. There's a lot of big banks down here. I can get you a meeting with some lackey who probably can't help you, but my next door neighbor, right? So,
Gotta tell her that you can.
Thank you for that.
This has been great, Peter. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your knowledge. I think in 6 months from now, if the world's changed, have you back on and talk a little bit about what we see. But as we know, this industry changes every day. So
yeah,
I just want to say thank you, Patrick. I'll let you close it up.
Again, Peter, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you becoming, and in all seriousness, bringing some of that expertise and bringing mainstream expertise into the cannabis industry so that we can have banking experts to help navigate what is really choppy waters. So we do appreciate that, and just thank you for coming on and taking your spot in the rotation.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for having me on.